My aunt looked at me across the conference table like I was the problem. Like I was the one who had spent the last 18 months quietly dismantling everything my grandmother had built. She had her reading glasses pushed up into her hair and a smile so practiced it looked painted on, and when she reached across to pat my hand, I pulled it away before she could make contact. I said very quietly that I wanted her to think carefully about what she was about to sign. She laughed. She actually laughed. My mother, sitting to her right, stared at the wall. I looked at the attorney and nodded once. Let me tell you what it took to get to that room. But first drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this reaches. My grandmother, Eleanor, died on a Tuesday in late November. I was in the middle of a 12-hour shift in the ICU when my phone buzzed against my thigh and I saw my mother's name on the screen. I already knew. I had known since the previous Friday when I sat beside the bed and held her hand and she looked at me with those clear gray eyes and said, "Nora, you were always the one who paid attention." I didn't know what she meant then. I thought she was just tired. I thought she was saying goodbye the way old people do. In riddles, in half sentences, in things you only understand later when it's already too late to ask. She left me her house. That part I knew. She had told me directly, 2 years before she got sick, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the kind of straightforward calm that was just who she was. She said, "Your uncle and your aunt have their own things. Your mother has your father's pension. You're the one putting yourself through nursing school and working nights and you're the one who came every Sunday for 14 years without being asked." She slid an envelope across the table. "I want you to have the house when I'm gone. The deed is in there." I had a lawyer draw it up. Don't lose it. I didn't lose it. But when I filed the paperwork 6 weeks after the funeral, the title company called me to say there was a discrepancy, a lien, against the property, for $112,000, attached to a home equity line of credit that had been opened 22 months before my grandmother died. I didn't scream. I was standing in the hospital parking garage still in my scrubs and I just stood there in the cold for a full 30 seconds listening to the ambient hum of the ventilation system. Then I asked the woman on the phone to repeat the account number. I recognized the last 4 digits. I had seen them before, on a bank statement my grandmother had handed me once when she asked me to help her check her balance online. She was careful with money. She didn't borrow. She had lived in that house for 41 years and she had paid it off before I was born and she used to say that debt was just future suffering with a payment plan attached. She had not opened a home equity line of credit. I told the title company I would call them back. I sat in my car. I thought about my aunt, Renee. I thought about the way she had started coming around more often in the last 2 years of my grandmother's life. Weekly visits that turned into daily ones. Errands she ran, appointments she drove to, paperwork she offered to organize. I had been grateful at the time. I was working nights and I couldn't always be there and Renee had seemed genuinely attentive. Generous, even. I thought about a specific afternoon, maybe 16 months before my grandmother died. I had stopped by after a day shift and found Renee at the kitchen table with a folder of documents and my grandmother in the chair beside her, signing. I asked what they were signing and Renee said, "Just updating some financial access permissions. Power of attorney housekeeping. You know how much paperwork there is when someone gets older." My grandmother looked up at me and said something I dismissed at the time. She said, "Renee explained it all." And then she looked back down and kept signing. She trusted her daughter. Of course, she did. Renee was her daughter. I sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes, and I did not allow myself to feel the betrayal yet because the betrayal was a room I could not afford to walk into until I had everything I needed. I put the car in drive. I had work to do. I did not call Renee. I did not call my mother. I went home, I made coffee, and I opened my laptop. The first thing I did was contact the bank directly. I told them I was assisting in the estate settlement of the account holder and that I had concerns about the account's origin. They couldn't give me full details without the right documentation, but the representative confirmed that the account had been opened in person and that a cosigner with power of attorney authority had been present. She used a phrase that I wrote down verbatim. The account was opened under standard POA authorization procedures. I requested a copy of the POA document on file. It arrived by secure email 3 days later. I opened it and read my grandmother's signature at the bottom, the date beside it, and the name of the notary who had witnessed it. The notary's name was Margaret Holloway, and the document had been notarized in the city where my grandmother lived. I pulled up the state notary registry. Margaret Holloway had surrendered her commission 14 months before that document was signed. She couldn't have notarized it. She wasn't a notary anymore when that signature appeared next to her stamp. I printed the document. I printed the registry record. I put them both in a folder, and I labeled it the same way I label everything in the ICU when something needs to be tracked carefully. I wrote the date at the top and I wrote, "Do not misplace." Over the next 2 weeks, I requested every document associated with the home equity account. The application, the disbursement records, the account activity for the entire 22 months it had been open. The money had gone out in 6 transfers, spaced several months apart, ranging from $12,000 to $26,000 each. The destination account was a joint checking account belonging to Renee and her husband. $112,000. Drawn against my grandmother's house. Moved into my aunt's account while my grandmother was declining, while I was working nights, while Renee was there every day being helpful. My grandmother had not known. I was certain of that. She had trusted Renee to handle the paperwork and Renee had handled it, just not the way my grandmother thought. Every Sunday I came to that house and sat with her, and she never mentioned a loan because she did not know there was a loan. She thought Renee was managing things. She thought the documents she signed were what Renee said they were. There was one more thing I needed to confirm. I called a former colleague who now worked in elder financial abuse investigations. I described the situation without naming anyone and she said, without hesitation, that what I was describing was textbook. She said the POA is usually the first thing they get because it's the key to everything. She said, if the notarization is fraudulent, you've got document forgery on top of the financial crimes. She told me to contact an attorney and to not move or disturb any of the paper trail. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat for a moment and thought about my grandmother's hands, how they looked at the end, how thin they had become, how she had trusted her daughter to sit beside her at that table and hand her things to sign. I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel that. Then I picked up the phone and called an estate attorney. His name was David Hartwell. He was thorough and he was not surprised, which was somehow the most unsettling part of our first meeting. He said he saw this pattern regularly. He said the fraudulent POA, the home equity line, the transfers to a family member's personal account, it was a well-worn script. He reviewed my documents and told me I had enough to support a referral to the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit and potentially the FBI if the wire transfers crossed certain thresholds. He said, "What do you want to do?" I said I wanted her to commit. He looked at me over his reading glasses. I explained. Renee didn't know I had any of this. As far as she knew, I had called the title company, hit a snag, and was frustrated and confused. She had called me twice in the past 10 days with an air of sympathy, offering to help me navigate the complication. She kept using the word complication, like it was a weather event, like it was something that had just happened to all of us equally. I had been non-committal. I had let her think I was overwhelmed. Which I was. Just not in the way she imagined. David nodded slowly. He understood what I meant. If Renee believed I was coming to him to sign something routine, she might show up too. She might sit across a table and lie on the record. He said, "Let me make a call." 3 days later, Renee called me. Her voice was warm, the way it always was when she wanted something. She said she had spoken with a probate attorney who could help untangle the lien situation. She said it was really just a matter of signing a release acknowledgement. She said, "You know how estates get complicated when there are multiple parties with financial connections to the property." I almost laughed at the elegant vagueness of that sentence. Multiple parties with financial connections. She meant herself. She meant the money she had taken. She said the attorney could see us that Thursday. She said it would be fast, just a formality. Just me acknowledging that the lien would be resolved from the estate funds before the deed transferred. She said, "Nora, I just want this wrapped up for you. I know how hard the last few months have been." I said, "Thursday works." I paused a moment and then I said, "Will my mother be there?" Renee said she had already called her. She said it would be good for all of us to be in the same room. Closure. I didn't say anything to that. I said I would see her Thursday and I ended the call. I did not sleep well that week. Not because of fear, but because every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that kitchen 14 months before my grandmother died, watching her sign something she didn't understand, and I was standing in the doorway saying nothing. I had been tired. I had just finished a night shift. I had trusted Renee too. That memory did not make me hesitate. It made me methodical. On Wednesday, I met with David again. I gave him the complete file. The original fraudulent POA and the notary registry records showing Margaret Holloway's commission had lapsed. The HELOC application and disbursement records. The transfer history to Renee's joint account. The title company's documentation showing the lien. An affidavit I had signed in front of a notary, a real, currently commissioned one attesting to the timeline of my grandmother's estate planning and the conversations she and I had about the deed. David reviewed everything. He said it was clean. He said he had coordinated with the State Financial Crimes Unit and that an investigator would be available to receive a formal referral immediately following the signing. He said, "You understand that what you're doing is letting her perjure herself." I said I understood. He said, "If she signs the document we're presenting and affirms the lien is a valid estate obligation, she is lying under oath in front of a licensed attorney with a duty to report. Combined with the evidence you've provided, that's no longer a civil dispute. That's criminal exposure. Multiple counts." "I know," I said. He said, "I want to make sure you understand this will almost certainly mean criminal charges against your aunt. And depending on what we find when investigators get access to her records, potentially your mother as well if she had knowledge." I looked at the folder on his desk. I thought about my grandmother saying, "You were always the one who paid attention." I thought about $112,000 moving out of her house in the dark while she sat in her chair and trusted the people around her. I said, "I understand." Thursday arrived the way consequential days always do, looking exactly like any other day until it doesn't. I drove to the office building downtown. I found parking on the first try, which felt like the universe acknowledging that this was already decided. I took the elevator to the 4th floor. I was 20 minutes early. I was wearing a dark blazer over my work clothes. Not a costume, just the version of me that meant business. I sat in the waiting area and I went over the sequence of events one more time in my head, the same way I run through a procedure before a complicated case. Know the steps. Know what comes next. Don't improvise when you don't have to. Renee arrived at 2 minutes to the hour with my mother behind her. Renee was in a pale green dress I had never seen before. She was carrying a leather portfolio. She looked the way she always looked when she was confident, slightly ahead of everyone else, already talking before she reached the reception desk. My mother was quieter. She glanced at me when she came in and something moved across her face that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite apology. It was the expression of someone who had been told a particular story so many times they had stopped questioning whether it was true. We were shown into the conference room. David was already inside, papers arranged neatly in front of him. He had said he would play it straight. He would present the documents as if this were a standard estate closure meeting. He would let Renee lead herself to the edge. Renee settled in, across from me, and opened her portfolio. She pulled out a set of documents and slid copies across the table toward me and toward my mother. She explained in her warm, organized way that these were the forms that would allow the estate to formally acknowledge the HELOC as a valid debt, authorize the lien to be resolved from the estate proceeds before title transferred, and close out the property cleanly. She used the word cleanly. I noticed that. David looked at his copies and asked a series of professional, unremarkable questions about the timeline of the HELOC origination. Renee answered all of them. She used phrases like financial planning assistance and necessary liquidity support and coordinated with Eleanor's full knowledge and consent. She was smooth. She was well prepared. She had been telling this story to herself for a long time. David slid the primary form toward her. He pointed to the declaration at the bottom of page 3. He said, "I need you to confirm that the home equity line of credit reflected in this lien was originated with the knowledge and voluntary consent of the property owner, Eleanor Calloway, and that the funds were used for purposes she approved." Renee picked up the pen. My mother was looking at the table. I watched Renee's hand. I thought about all the things I could have said in that moment. I could have stopped it. I could have said, "Don't." I could have given her one last exit. But that would have made it a family argument. That would have made it her word against mine, an old disagreement between relatives about an old woman's estate, the kind of thing attorneys quietly settled and families quietly survived without anyone being held accountable for anything. I needed her to choose it herself. I needed her to make the decision with full information about what she was doing. She knew the money had been moved. She knew the POA was forged. She was choosing to sign anyway because she believed I didn't know. She signed. The scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room. David took the document back. He looked at it. Then he set it down and reached beneath his notepad and slid a different folder across the table toward Renee. "I want to direct your attention to a few documents before we proceed," he said. His voice was exactly the same as it had been for the last 15 minutes. Calm. Professional. Not unkind. Renee looked at the folder. The first document is a copy of the power of attorney form on file with the bank that originated the HELOC, David said. The second is a certified record from the State Notary Commission. The commission record shows that Margaret Holloway, the notary listed on that POA, had surrendered her commission 14 months before the document was notarized. Renee didn't move. The third document, he said, is an affidavit provided by my client. And the fourth is the disbursement and transfer history for the HELOC account, showing $112,000 transferred to an account held jointly by you and your husband. My mother made a sound. Not words. Just a sound. Renee looked at me. I looked back at her. I had been sitting with this for 3 weeks. I had arranged every piece of it carefully and quietly, and I had let her come to this room and choose to lie in front of a licensed attorney, and I felt almost nothing in that moment except a very specific kind of tired. I said, "I have been paying attention my whole life." David said, "I'm required to inform you that the declaration you just signed constitutes a false statement made in connection with a legal proceeding. I have a duty to report this, and I will be doing so today. I'd strongly recommend you not sign anything further and that you contact your own attorney immediately." Renee pushed her chair back. She said something I don't remember exactly what. Some version of it wasn't what it looks like. Some version of "I can explain." Some version of "Nora, you don't understand what I was dealing with." I have heard that sentence in various forms from various people my entire life. And I have learned that when someone says "you don't understand what I was dealing with," what they mean is they would like to not be held responsible for what they chose to do. My mother said my name. She said it the way she used to say it when I was a child, and I had done something she couldn't quite bring herself to punish me for. Nora. Like an acknowledgement and an apology and a request all at once. I looked at her. I said, she took money from Grandma's house while Grandma was dying. She forged the documents to do it. You knew, and you didn't tell me. My mother didn't deny it. That was the part that I had been least prepared for. I had run through 100 versions of this conversation in my head, and in most of them she said it isn't true or I didn't know anything about it. She didn't say either of those things. She looked at the table and she said she was going to pay it back. I stood up. I picked up my bag. I said to David that I would be in touch, and I thanked him and I walked to the door. Renee called after me. She said, Nora, we are family. I stopped at the door. I did not turn around. I said, that is exactly why I handled it this way instead of a worse one. I left. In the elevator on the way down, I stood very still and I stared at the floor numbers changing, and I thought about my grandmother's kitchen and the smell of it, coffee and dish soap and something slightly floral from the candle she always kept on the windowsill. I thought about 14 years of Sunday afternoons and the way she would already have the kettle on when I arrived, like she had been waiting, like she always expected me to show up. I had always shown up. I got to my car. I sat for a moment. Then I drove home. The referral to the State Financial Crimes Unit was filed that afternoon. The bank was notified of the fraudulent POA and the HELOC was flagged for review. An investigator contacted me within 48 hours. Over the following weeks, I submitted the full documentation, the notary records, the transfer history, the timeline of my grandmother's estate planning, the conversations I remembered, the deed she had given me 2 years before she got sick. I submitted the security footage from the title company's lobby showing Renee's expression when she left the building that day. I submitted it all. The formal charges came down 11 weeks later. Wire fraud. Document forgery. Elder financial exploitation. The HELOC was declared fraudulent and the lien on the property was voided. My aunt did not go to prison. She received a suspended sentence, 3 years of supervised probation, a significant fine, and a civil judgment requiring full restitution. Her husband's retirement account was partially liquidated to satisfy the judgment. The legal fees alone were more than they had expected. I was told by the investigator that in her statement she had said she always intended to repay it. They always intend to repay it. My mother called me twice in the weeks after. I let both calls go to voicemail. Her messages were not apologies, exactly. They were more like explanations. She said Renee had been in financial trouble for years, and she hadn't known how bad it was until after it had already started. She said she thought it would be resolved quietly. She said she was sorry I found out the way I did, which is a very specific way of being sorry, not sorry for the thing itself, but sorry for the disruption it caused. I wrote her a letter. Not an email. An actual letter, the kind my grandmother used to write. I said I understood that she had been in a difficult position. I said I understood that it is hard to report someone you love. I said that my grandmother worked for 41 years to own that house and she died believing it was safe and clean and mine, and what was done to her was not a complication. It was a theft. I said I needed time. I said I was not closing the door, just not opening it right now. I sent it. I have not heard back. The house closed on a Wednesday afternoon in February, 3.5 months after I first received that call from the title company. I drove there after the paperwork was done. I used the key I had kept on my keychain since my grandmother gave it to me 6 years ago. I walked through the rooms. The furniture was mostly still there, some of it would go to family, some I would keep. The kitchen smelled less like itself without the candle on the windowsill. I stood in the middle of it for a while. On the counter, I found something I had not noticed before. A small index card in my grandmother's handwriting, tucked behind the bread box where she used to leave grocery lists and phone numbers. It said, Nora, I left the good pan in the back of the cabinet. Don't let anyone else have it. I stood there with that index card for a long time. Then I found the pan. A cast iron skillet, seasoned for decades, heavier than it looks. I wrapped it in a dish towel and carried it out to my car. There is an instinct, I have learned, to want to forgive people who betray you. To want the story to end with a reconciliation, a conversation in a bright room where everyone says what they should have said and the air clears and the damage is undone. That instinct is generous and it is human and I am not immune to it. But I have also learned, in the ICU and in courtrooms and in kitchens that smell like things that are gone, that some damage is not undone. It is just survived. Documented. Settled. My grandmother knew I paid attention. She was right. I did. I paid attention to every unsigned form, every certificate, every transfer, every timestamp, every call I almost made and didn't. I paid attention in that conference room when I let Renee choose, fully and freely, and she chose the same way she had always chosen. And I paid attention to the fact that when it was over, I walked out of that building carrying nothing that wasn't already mine. The house is mine. The pan is mine. The silence on my phone is mine. I paid for that silence. I want you to know it was worth every single thing it cost. If someone in your family ever made you feel like what you had was theirs to take, leave a heart in the comments. And if you want to know what happened at the restitution hearing, subscribe. I'll tell you everything.